Hi friends, welcome to episode 21 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own, or when appropriate, I cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. This episode will be posted on President's Day, and my hope is that everyone is enjoying their federal holiday doing something other than working. Upon closer inspection, I discovered that only 38 states actually recognize President's Day, and apparently we can't all agree on what to call this holiday either. Today's episode is titled Genius Hour, and some of my regular listeners have probably noticed that I don't jump right in, but rather I spend some time addressing other items which came up this week. I promise that this podcast is dedicated entirely to school libraries and school librarians. And to that end, I will keep the focus of each segment on all things relevant to school libraries and those of us who work in them. So I missed mentioning her on the episode about celebrities and politicians as authors, but California Senator Kamala Harris and her picture book, Superheroes Are Everywhere, was on the New York Times bestseller list briefly for about 3 weeks, and it rose as high as number 7. I'll attach a link in the YouTube video of her reading to a classroom of students. What is interesting is the timing of her memoir, The Truths We Hold, which was released on January 8 of this year. Forbes magazine described this as a, quote, soft launch, end quote, in lieu of the more traditional initiating of an exploratory committee in advance of declaring her candidacy for the 2020 presidential election. She formally announced on January 21st of this year, and this I didn't expect, a middle grade version of her memoir is slated to be published later this fall. I am amused in covering all the bases that a children's book, a memoir, and a middle grade version are being utilized in sort of a type of literary diplomacy in this effort to get out some name recognition and perhaps some subtle messaging about the candidate to as broad a voting population as possible. Kamala Harris is certainly not the first candidate to use this strategy, and she won't be the last. And for the second time in 2 weeks, I stumbled across a great addition to my library lessons while listening to a podcast I enjoy from Planet Money called The Indicator. It fills major holes in my basic understanding of economics, and it does so in a way that I don't feel lost or talked down to. There are daily episodes, they're 10 minutes long, and this Tuesday's episode was titled Fortnite vs. Backpack Kid, Dance Battle Royale. I've included a link to this podcast episode in my show notes. Spend any amount of time with kids under the age of 13, and you have most certainly seen a dance they do called the floss. Floss. I get to see an entire class flossing as they line up and wait for their teacher to come and pick them up from library. As much as I'd prefer to use a clip from a mainstream media outlet, the YouTube broadcast by Holly Scoop was appropriate to show to elementary students. I've included a link in the show notes. This was a terrific curricular tie-in. It's 2 minutes long, and I showed it to my 3rd graders, my 4th graders, and my 5th graders this week. We have already had our lesson on plagiarism this year, so before I played the clip, I asked them all to think about why I thought they should see this particular clip. And we had the best conversation. All of the students' hands shot up and shared why Fortnite was going to lose this case in court. We discussed intellectual property of a 16-year-old, and that is when my students told me that, in fact, a fellow named the Mashed Potato Man actually originated the dance moves called the floss. And finding relevant examples of plagiarism can be tricky when you're teaching elementary students, and I'm sensing a future podcast episode in the works. February is also the library's annual Bookmark Contest for March's Reading Month. All the elementary libraries in our district sponsor this contest, and it has been such a long-standing tradition that to suggest not doing it is verboten. So I included a link in the show notes of the entry form I use. Please feel free to make a copy for yourselves. The size of the bookmark is very intentional. You can fit 4 across using a standard piece of paper. I have 8 winners, as it's explained in the handout, and new this year, I created a Powtoon video, which the classroom teachers can all show when they handed out the forms. I like using the Powtoon video because it offered the simplest way to convey all the details consistently across all classrooms. Unlike morning or video announcements, the Powtoon format is unexpected, and I found that my students tend to pay attention. When I play this video, I do insist that I'm the one who gets to read the slides aloud, and for younger students, this is necessary because they simply can't read fast enough. And for the older students, I do not know why. They all want to read aloud, but having 26 of them reading aloud is 25 too many. So generally, we don't pass the forms out during library because it would take 4 days to see all the classes. We teach on an A, B, C, D rotation. So the library assistant puts class sets of copies in each of the teachers' mailboxes on the first day. I give the kids 2 weeks and I collect all the entries on the day we get out for midwinter break. Over break, I'll pick the winners, one from each grade, and 2 winners from the classes with the most entries. I scan those entries, I create JPEGs, and then a Google Draw of all the winning designs. I insert the winner's name, their grade and school, and year at the bottom of each bookmark. I purchase bright cardstock when it goes on sale, and I print from our school copier. Some of my fellow librarians send the print jobs out to the printers, but I find that takes time and costs well over $50 each for each building. The winners will be announced on March 1st. The details can be seen in the 2 links I provided in the show notes. I will say that Powtoon is a fun and creative cloud-based platform for transforming and animating slideshows. Educators can access a freemium version, and you can host the video on the Powtoon site rather than uploading it to YouTube. There is a considerable learning curve, but the payoff is worth it in my opinion. I have a Powtoon that I use for explaining library behaviors and expectations, which I show at the beginning of the school year for my upper elementary. It buys me about 2 minutes, and I get to collect my thoughts, and I find the students are very attentive. I'll attach a link in the show notes. And now, our topic for today, Genius Hour, also known as Passion Projects or 20% Time. I have twin sons, now 16 years old, and both wonderfully unique in their strengths and their interests. When they were in the 5th grade, my son Sam decided that he wanted to solve a Rubik's Cube. He is self-taught, mostly from watching YouTube tutorials, I think, because his dad and I have only one way to solve a Rubik's Cube, and that is to disassemble it and put it back together. Being that this hobby was vastly preferred to investing in video games, we were more than happy to indulge this interest, and by the time he was in middle school, Sam had amassed a collection of almost 30 different versions of the Rubik's Cube. Early in 8th grade, Sam announced that he was doing his research assignment in English class on the Rubik's Cube. Now, my children are no different than anyone else's, and they can be extremely persuasive. But I wasn't sure how my son had managed to convince his teacher to let him pick this particular topic. This was the first time I had ever heard the term passion project. True to its name, my son loved working on this assignment. I am learning that the duration of these projects is determined by the teacher, and in some cases, the passion project would take the place of a more traditional research assignment. In researching for this episode, I did come across the 3 terms which are similar in their intention and their end product. Genius Hour, passion projects, and 20% time seem to all have their origins in large corporations. When I went down the internet rabbit hole, some of these stories more resembled urban myths and legends, and how long Google used 20% time and which Google products are the direct result of this somewhat controversial approach to management is debatable. I found a TEDx talk given by Kevin Brookhouser, which is on his website, 20time.org. I'll include a link in the show notes. He describes implementing 20% in his classroom, in effect, giving his students 1 day a week to tackle something that interests them. I did find a helpful introductory blog post, which I'll also include in the show notes, on the blog mindsinbloom.com on May 9th, 2016. Kimberly Crouch wrote an article titled Implementing Genius Hour in Your Classroom. She describes Genius Hour as, quote, an inquiry-based learning project in which students work on individual projects focused on their passion, where they can create, explore, learn, build, invent, modify, write, or follow any passion that they have in life, end quote. Kimberly goes on to explain the importance of student choice and how Genius Hour fosters student creativity, something which is oftentimes missing from many classroom assignments these days. Most helpful, I think, to anyone considering implementing this type of project is that, based on her experience, Kimberly felt Genius Hour was an opportunity to teach, quote, students life skills, responsibility, planning, overcoming obstacles, and goal setting, end quote. Regardless, how schools incorporate this concept has, in my experience, had a direct impact on the use of library, both print and digital resources, as well as requiring the attention of the school librarian. And while this undertaking can be really time-consuming, it puts the librarian and our research lessons front and center. This is our opportunity to showcase our knowledge of our collection and accessing databases which are best suited to each grade level. If your school district monitors annual circulation numbers, the introduction of passion projects in our Genius Hours will translate into noticeable increases in your circulation stats. The second grade teachers in my district have all taken up Genius Hour this year. This is in large part due to our district PD day on Election Day this past November. It was a great presentation offered on Genius Hour in the elementary school. Because the presenter was a second grade teacher, all of her examples and the handouts she shared collectively were for second grade teachers in their classrooms, and they saw this initiative as being very doable. As a result, the library and library staffs are finding ourselves in demand in what is turning out to be a once per trimester project, so 3 times a year. So what does this mean for the librarians and the assistants? Well, it doesn't make sense to have 26 second graders descending on the library, all expecting to have their research needs addressed in a 45-minute visit to the library. What I have asked is that the teachers share a Google Doc with their class roster and their students' topics well in advance of a class visit to the library. The Genius Hour topics, when in the elementary level, are pretty standard fare. Animals, outer space, dinosaurs. These are easy because our libraries will have multiple copies. The trick is to select the 2 books for each topic which are best suited for, in this case, second grade readers. And that is why I expect to have a list of students' topics in advance. The more challenging topics will include famous people and countries. These topics are more dependent on current publications. Nobody cares that my Hammerhead Shark book has a copyright date of 1997. However, a Genius Hour project on Steph Curry or Meghan Markle will require recent information. The most challenging of student topics are those on YouTube personalities, Nickelodeon stars, fads, and the newest video games. These last type of searches lend themselves to Googles. And as a librarian of very young students, I try to keep my students on school databases as much as possible. As I tell my students, Google does not know that you are 8. There are some students who will need additional help in narrowing their topic. They know what they want to learn, but they lack the terminology. For example, one of my students wants to study vortexes. This wasn't enough for me to pull materials for him in advance. He and I would have to discuss this when he came to the library. I tell teachers that I will pre-search and pull materials so that when the class arrives, each student either has 2 books that they can check out or 2 books ordered from other libraries in our network en route. You may wonder, if I'm pulling the books for my students, doesn't that shortchange their experience of researching? Were I a public librarian attending 1 patron at a time, I could approach the request much differently. However, with 26 students all requiring assistance at the same time, I found a much better use of my time and theirs is to pull the best books for them and to use our class time for demonstrating which databases they should be exploring. I created a checklist, which I will include in the show notes. And on this list, I write the student's name and their topic. I also write down what I did for each of the students. I pulled 2 books from which school library, did I order books for them, or in some cases, when there are no books available, I wrote down which database they would find most useful in their research, and then this checklist goes back with them to class. In some very unusual cases, I will do an internet search, which is something we don't suggest second graders do, for the most authoritative and age-appropriate material I could find. A good example of this Genius Hour topic was how pearls are made. A search of an online encyclopedia and other databases produced articles on Pearl Harbor and on the author Pearl Buck. Needless to say, I had to do a little bit of extra searching. I have adjusted some of my lessons to accommodate Genius Hour in our current second grade curriculum. In the past, we've focused our research skills around a living museum project, which takes place in the spring, and all the kids dress up as a character they've researched and give their speeches. I've saved our research skills until spring break, when that becomes more relevant. Now, I need to introduce those research skills much earlier in the fall, and we revisit them throughout the year. As luck would have it, I received 2 emails this week related to researching and Genius Hour. Mari, a loyal listener from California, asked me about the databases I was using when I teach research skills. Michigan residents are fortunate to have access to databases acquired by the Library of Michigan and available through MEL, Michigan Electronic Library. This is a tax-funded initiative, and thankfully, it frees up my budget to be spent on print materials. The database I use, and I'm elementary, would be World Book Online, Britannica School, EBSCO's Explora, and EBSCO's eBooks. I also use some databases whose subscriptions are provided by our local public library. I emailed the coordinator of these digital resources to find out which other states offered similar statewide e-resources, and I would like to thank Liz Breed, who is MEL's coordinator, for her feedback. Some of the statewide programs that we learned about were Wisconsin's Badger Link, Indiana's Inspire, the Florida Electronic Library. Texas has 2, TextShare and TextQuest. South Carolina has Discuss, DISCUS, and Wyoming has Go Wild, spelled GOWYLD. The best suggestion I can give, if you don't have state-provided databases, is to go to your public library and see if you can use their database URLs on your library resource page. The second email I received this week came from Sonia Norris, who is a library consultant with the Library of Michigan. It was a detailed account of how a public librarian used the MEL databases to assist an 8th grade patron who is researching a passion project. I am reminded that while school librarians are familiar with the research assignments given to our students because we work with those teachers every day, the public librarians find out about them only when students come to visit their libraries and to assist them. In this circumstance, the student benefited from the team effort of both the school librarians and the public librarians working on this project with them. And what made this story especially sweet was that the student returned to the public library to let the librarian know she had earned an A+ on her project. Before I sign off for today, I would like to say one last thing, and this pertains to the AASL discussion board conversation this week pertaining to student self-checkout. I would be a huge fan if we could do this in our libraries. Unfortunately, it's one of those things which is, in our particular circumstance, beyond our control. We happen to be networked not just with the 14 school libraries, but also with the 3 public libraries. And there's a lot of advantages that come with that. It means that we can interlibrary loan from a total of 17 libraries. The caveat being that we have to use the circulation software that was chosen not for the school libraries in mind, but for the public libraries in mind. So when we run checkout, we can not only access every student in the school district, but the personal information of 80,000 patrons who live in our communities. So consequently, as much as I would love to see a student checkout, self-checkout in our libraries, it's not something that we're going to be able to do anytime soon. I would like to thank you for listening today. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Share this podcast with other school librarians in your district or your PLN. Consider leaving a rating as it helps other school librarians learn about this podcast. I would like to thank composer Nazar Ryback at hooksounds.com for the music you've heard today. And as always, I welcome your feedback and contributions. Please email me at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. The topic of our next episode will be Dr. Seuss. I hope you will tune in.